The sky over Europe in 1943 was a killing ground unlike any the world had ever seen. At 25,000 feet, where the air was so thin men could barely breathe and temperatures plunged to 50 degrees below zero, young Americans and Germans fought desperate, battles that lasted only seconds but determined whether hundreds of men lived or died. The Boeing B-24 Liberator was supposed to be the weapon that would break the back of Nazi Germany. 4 engines, a wingspan of 110 feet, and capable of carrying 8,000 pounds of bombs deep into the heart of the Third Reich. But the B-24 had another distinction that made it both feared and respected. It was a flying fortress bristling with 10 50 caliber machine guns, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. Every one of those guns was aimed by a human being, a gunner whose sole purpose was to kill anyone who came close enough to threaten his aircraft. For the Luftwaffe fighter pilots tasked with stopping these massive bombing formations, approaching a B-24 was entering a gauntlet of death. The moment a gunner spotted an enemy fighter, a deadly game of mathematics and violence began. Speed, angle, distance, deflection. Get any of these wrong and you were dead. Get them all right, and maybe, just maybe, you could shoot down a bomber before its guns tore you and your aircraft to pieces. Let's begin with what the Luftwaffe pilots faced. Picture yourself as Oberleutnant Hans Müller, a 23-year-old fighter pilot with the Jagdgeschwader 26, stationed at an airfield in occupied France. It's August 1943, and you've just received the alert. American bombers are approaching, headed for the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. You sprint to your Focke-Wulf 190, your ground crew already has her warmed up. The engine roars to life, and within minutes you're airborne, climbing hard to intercept altitude. At 18,000 feet you spot them. Not one bomber, not 10, but hundreds. They're arranged in what the Americans call a combat box formation, a 3-dimensional chessboard of death, designed specifically to maximize the firepower they can bring to bear on you. Each box contains up to 54 bombers, stacked and staggered so that their fields of fire overlap. There are no blind spots. There are no safe approaches. Every angle you can attack from is covered by multiple gun positions. You're flying at 350 miles per hour. The B-24s are lumbering along at 180. This speed differential is both your greatest advantage and your most terrifying challenge. You have perhaps 3 to 5 seconds of firing time as you close from 1,000 yards to 200 yards. 3 to 5 seconds to aim, to compensate for deflection, to pour enough rounds into a specific part of the bomber to kill it before you have to break away or collide with it. But those B-24 gunners have been tracking you since you were a speck on the horizon, maybe 4,000 yards away. They've been calling out your position, calculating your attack vector, training their guns on the point in space where you're going to be, not where you are. The typical B-24 crew consisted of 10 men. The pilot and co-pilot in the cockpit, the bombardier and navigator in the nose, the flight engineer manning the top turret behind the cockpit, 2 waist gunners, one on each side of the fuselage, a ball turret gunner suspended in a glass sphere under the belly, a tail gunner in the rear and a nose turret gunner up front. Each position had a specific field of fire, but together they created an overlapping sphere of destruction. The most feared position for any attacking Luftwaffe pilot was the tail gun. This gunner had an unobstructed view directly behind the aircraft and could track targets from extreme range. Tail gunners, like Staff Sergeant Michael Aruth, became legends for their ability to destroy German fighters before they could even get into effective firing range. Aruth was credited with killing 8 Luftwaffe pilots, each time waiting until the attacking fighter committed to its approach run before opening fire. The physics of the engagement were brutally simple. A 50 caliber round weighed about 2 ounces and traveled at 2,900 feet per second. It could punch through aluminum, steel, even armor plate at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. It could shatter an engine block, explode a fuel tank, or tear a human body literally in half. Each of the 10 guns on a B-24 could put 800 of these rounds downrange every minute. Do the math. That's 8,000 rounds per minute from a single bomber. If you were attacking a combat box of 18 bombers, you were flying into a stream of 144,000 rounds per minute. The Luftwaffe developed specific attack tactics to try to overcome this firepower disadvantage. The most common was the head-on pass. German pilots would approach from 12 o'clock high, diving down through the formation, trying to knock out the lead bomber. The theory was sound. The B-24's frontal armament was initially weak, just 2 guns in the nose turret and maybe handheld guns fired by the bombardier and navigator. But attacking head-on meant a closing speed of over 500 miles per hour. You had less than 2 seconds of firing time. Miss, and you were now flying through the formation with bombers all around you, every gunner tracking you, firing at you. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke, one of the Luftwaffe's most successful bomber killers, described the experience in his diary. He wrote about seeing the muzzle flashes from the bombers' guns, dozens of them twinkling like fireflies, knowing that each flash represented rounds coming at him at nearly 3 times the speed of sound. He described the sound of bullets hitting his aircraft, metallic impacts that felt like hail on a tin roof, except each hailstone could kill him. He described the fear, constant and corrosive, knowing that on any attack run, he might simply disintegrate. His fighter ripped apart by converging streams of fire from multiple bombers. The Luftwaffe pilots called attacking the B-24 formations running the gauntlet, or going through the wall of fire. Statistics bore out their fears. In the summer of 1943, the Luftwaffe was losing fighters and pilots at an unsustainable rate. For every bomber shot down, Germany was losing 2 fighters. The pilots they could replace, at least for a while, but the experience, the skill, the hard-won tactical knowledge that was bleeding away with every mission. Let's focus on what happened inside a B-24 during an attack. The intercom would crackle to life. Fighters, 11 o'clock high, coming in fast. The top turret gunner would swing his twin 50s around, tracking the approaching dot. The nose turret gunner would do the same. The waist gunners would watch their sectors, waiting. The ball turret gunner, suspended in his glass and metal sphere beneath the aircraft, would rotate to cover the underside approach. Time seemed to slow down and speed up simultaneously. The fighter grew from a dot to a recognizable aircraft in seconds. Focke-Wulf 190, the most dangerous fighter the Luftwaffe had. Fast, heavily armed, and flown by pilots who were running out of options and knew that desperation made for dangerous enemies. The top turret gunner, Technical Sergeant James O'Brien, had seen fighters before. This was his 15th mission. He'd shot at plenty of them, seen a few go down, though he could never be sure if his bullets had been the fatal ones, or if other gunners had made the kill. It didn't matter. When a fighter came at you, you fired. You fired until your guns were empty or the fighter was gone, one way or another. The Focke-Wulf was at 800 yards now, closing fast. O'Brien pressed his thumbs down on the firing buttons. The twin 50s roared to life, the sound filling his tiny turret compartment, the smell of burnt powder overwhelming even at altitude. He was aiming not at where the fighter was, but at where it would be, leading the target, just like shooting ducks back home in Minnesota, except this duck was shooting back. He could see the flashes from the fighter's cannons now, 20mm rounds, each one capable of blowing an engine off its mounts, or punching a hole the size of a dinner plate in the fuselage. Some of those rounds were explosive. If they hit you, you simply ceased to exist. The fighter pilot's perspective was entirely different. From Oberleutnant Müller's cockpit, the B-24 filled his windscreen. He targeted the number 3 engine, the inboard engine on the right wing. Kill an inboard engine, and you might start a fire. Fire meant the bomber was finished. But he had to concentrate, ignore the tracers arcing toward him, ignore the fear screaming at him to break off. Break off now. He thumbed the firing button on his control stick. His 4 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns erupted. He could see his rounds impacting the B-24's wing, sparks and fragments flying. But was it enough? Then his aircraft shuddered. Multiple impacts, heavy impacts, 50 caliber rounds walking up his left wing. He felt the fighter slew sideways as something critical was destroyed. He yanked the stick, braking left and down, diving away from the formation. Smoke was pouring from his engine. The cockpit was filling with fumes. He was losing altitude fast. He had to get down, get this dying aircraft on the ground before it became his coffin. He nursed the Focke-Wulf down through 8,000 feet, 5,000, 3,000. There, a field, recently harvested. He dropped his landing gear, or tried to. Only the right gear extended. The left had been shot away. He had no choice. He cut the engine, aimed for the softest-looking part of the field and held on. The fighter hit hard. The right gear collapsed immediately, and the aircraft skidded sideways across the field, tearing itself apart. When it finally stopped, Müller was still alive, bruised, bleeding from a cut on his forehead, but alive. He climbed out and watched black smoke rise from his wrecked aircraft. He'd failed to stop the bombers, and somewhere over France, that B-24 and its crew were still flying. Except they weren't in much better shape. The B-24 that O'Brien had been defending had taken multiple cannon strikes. One engine was dead, feathered to reduce drag. The hydraulic system was shot up, meaning the bomb bay doors might not close, and they were going to have trouble with the landing gear. 3 crewmen were wounded, including one of the waist gunners who'd taken shrapnel in the leg and shoulder. The bombardier was working on him with the first aid kit, trying to stop the bleeding. They still had 200 miles to fly over hostile territory before they reached the English Channel. 200 miles where more fighters might attack. 200 miles limping along on 3 engines, falling behind the protection of the formation. Stragglers were easy prey. Everyone knew it. The question wasn't if fighters would come after them, but when. This scenario played out thousands of times between 1942 and 1945. The statistics were horrifying on both sides. The US 8th Air Force, which conducted the daylight bombing campaign over Europe using B-24s and B-17s, lost over 26,000 men killed in action. Another 28,000 were captured after being shot down. The survival rate for completing a full tour of 25 missions was roughly 1 in 4. Every time a crew climbed into their bomber, they knew the odds were against them coming home. The Luftwaffe's losses were even more catastrophic in relative terms. By late 1943, the average life expectancy of a German fighter pilot on the Western Front was measured in weeks, not months. The experienced pilots who had trained before the war and fought in the Battle of Britain and over Russia were being killed faster than they could be replaced. Training time for new pilots was cut from years to months, then to weeks. These green pilots, with barely 50 hours of flight time, were thrown against veteran American bomber crews, protected by increasingly experienced escort fighters. The role of the B-24 gunner evolved significantly over the course of the war. Early in the campaign, gunners received minimal training. They'd fire a few hundred rounds at towed targets, attend some classroom lectures about deflection shooting and how to clear jams, and that was it. But as losses mounted, the training became more sophisticated. Gunners spent time in elaborate simulators that projected images of attacking fighters on screens, allowing them to practice tracking and leading targets without expending ammunition. They studied recognition charts until they could identify every German aircraft from any angle in a split second. They learned about fighter tactics, understanding that if they could predict what an attacking pilot would do, they could position their fire to intercept him. The development of the ball turret deserves special attention because it represented both an engineering marvel and a psychological nightmare. The Sperry ball turret was a rotating sphere of aluminum and plexiglass that hung beneath the bomber's fuselage. Inside, a gunner sat in a fetal position, his knees drawn up, surrounded by 2 50 caliber guns, ammunition feeds, a computing gun sight, and very little else. The space was so confined that ball turret gunners had to be small, usually under 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighing less than 150 pounds. They couldn't wear their parachutes inside the turret because there was no room. If the aircraft was damaged and needed to make an emergency landing, if the turret's rotation mechanism was shot out and the gunner was trapped, there was nothing anyone could do. The ball turret gunner either got out before landing or died when the aircraft's belly hit the ground. But from a tactical standpoint, the ball turret was devastating. It provided coverage of the bomber's entire undersurface, a position that had previously been vulnerable to attack. German pilots quickly learned that attacking from below was no longer a safe option. Ball turret gunners, like Staff Sergeant Alan Magee, became legends. Magee was blown out of his bomber without a parachute over France, fell over 20,000 feet, crashed through the glass roof of a railway station, and survived. His story became a symbol of the incredible resilience and luck that some men had, but also a reminder of the violence and chaos of air combat. The Germans tried multiple approaches to overcome the defensive firepower of the bomber formations. They experimented with heavy armament, mounting 30mm cannons, and even rockets on their fighters. These weapons had tremendous destructive power, but they were heavy, reduced the fighter's maneuverability, and had slow rates of fire. A fighter armed with these weapons became less effective in dogfights with American escort fighters. They tried coordinated attacks, with entire squadrons attacking a combat box simultaneously from multiple directions, trying to overwhelm the gunners with too many targets. This worked sometimes, but required a level of coordination and radio discipline that became harder to maintain as experienced pilots were killed and green. Replacements took their places. They even developed specialized bomber-killer aircraft like the Me-410, which was designed specifically to attack heavy bombers from beyond the range of defensive guns. But these aircraft were expensive. consumed resources desperately needed elsewhere, and were themselves vulnerable to escort fighters. The introduction of long-range American fighter escorts in late 1943 and early 1944 fundamentally changed the equation. P-47, Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings, and especially the P-51 Mustang could now accompany the bombers all the way to the target and back. Luftwaffe fighters attempting to attack the bombers now had to fight through screens of escorts. The two-front battle, having to worry about bomber gunners and fighter escorts simultaneously, was more than most German pilots could handle. The personal stories of the gunners themselves reveal the psychological toll of this type of combat. Technical Sergeant Benjamin Franklin survived 42 missions as a waist gunner, an almost unheard-of number. He described the experience as a combination of boredom and terror, hours of flying through empty sky, cold beyond belief, oxygen masks freezing to your face, then suddenly fighters everywhere, guns firing, men screaming, metal tearing, and trying to aim while your aircraft bucked and twisted as the pilot took evasive action. He described shooting at a Messerschmitt 109, seeing his tracers converging on it, seeing pieces fly off, seeing smoke, then seeing the pilot bail out, the parachute opened, the pilot floating down toward occupied France. Franklin remembered feeling nothing, no satisfaction, no remorse, nothing. That pilot had been trying to kill him and his crew. Franklin had stopped him. That was all there was to it. The emotional processing would come later, if it came at all. Many veterans never talked about what they'd done, never sought the therapy that might have helped, and carried the psychological scars for the rest of their lives. The technology race was relentless. The Germans developed the Schräge Musik system, an upward-firing cannon installation that allowed a night fighter to approach a bomber from directly below, in the blind spot, and fire up through the belly. This was devastatingly effective against bombers at night, but less useful during daylight raids, where the ball turret could still see and engage. The Americans responded with improved crew coordination systems, intercom modifications that allowed gunners to communicate more efficiently, and most importantly, improved training. By 1944, a B-24 gunner was a highly trained specialist who understood ballistics, deflection shooting, aircraft recognition, and crew coordination. The average skill level of American gunners increased steadily throughout the war, while the average skill level of Luftwaffe pilots declined. This shift in the quality differential was as important as any technological change. Let's examine a specific engagement that illustrates the deadly effectiveness of coordinated B-24 gunfire. On October 14, 1943, during the second raid on Schweinfurt, the Luftwaffe launched over 300 fighter sorties against the attacking bomber force. The 384th Bomb Group, flying B-17s and B-24s, was hit particularly hard. German fighters attacked in waves, some coming from head-on, others from the sides, still others diving from above. The bomber crews estimated they were under continuous fighter attack for over 90 minutes. In one B-24 named the Joker, every gunner fired until their barrels were glowing red and their ammunition was nearly exhausted. The tail gunner, Sergeant Robert Johnson, claimed 3 confirmed kills and 2 probables. The top turret gunner got 2. The ball turret gunner got 1 certain and damaged 2 others. But the cost was severe. The aircraft took over 200 hits. The co-pilot was killed by cannon fire. 2 engines were destroyed. The radio operator was badly wounded. They managed to make it back to England, but the aircraft never flew again. It was stripped for parts and scrapped. The Luftwaffe lost 28 fighters that day, either shot down by bomber gunners or destroyed in combat with escort fighters. 28 pilots killed or captured, and the bombers still hit their targets. The mathematics of attrition were becoming clear. Germany couldn't afford to lose fighters and pilots at this rate. The United States could afford to lose bombers faster than Germany could replace its fighters. The psychological impact on Luftwaffe pilots was profound. Major Gunther Roll, who survived the war as one of Germany's highest-scoring aces, later wrote about the dread that filled him every time he received orders to intercept bomber formations. He described it as flying into a wall of steel, knowing that men on those bombers were tracking you, calculating, waiting for you to get just close enough that they couldn't miss. He survived the war, but many of his friends and comrades did not. The final months of the war saw the Luftwaffe increasingly desperate. They introduced the Me-262 jet fighter, the first operational jet in the world. It was fast enough to outrun American escort fighters and could make lightning-fast attack passes on bomber formations. But even the Me-262 was vulnerable to gunner fire. American gunners learned to track them, to calculate the new deflection angles needed for the higher speeds, and Me-262s started falling to defensive fire. The technology had changed, but the fundamental dynamic hadn't. Men in bombers were still trying to kill men in fighters, and men in fighters were still trying to kill men in bombers. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe had essentially ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Fuel shortages, destroyed airfields, and catastrophic pilot losses meant that bomber formations often flew to their targets and back without seeing a single German fighter. The B-24 gunners who'd trained for months, who'd steeled themselves for combat, found themselves scanning empty skies. The war was effectively over. The final accounting was staggering. The 8th Air Force alone lost nearly 5,000 bombers over Europe. The Luftwaffe lost tens of thousands of aircraft and an entire generation of pilots. The B-24 gunners who survived went home, tried to readjust to civilian life, and carried with them memories of moments when they'd looked into the cockpit of an attacking fighter, seen a face behind the windscreen, pulled triggers, and watched that aircraft fall burning from the sky. The technology of air combat has evolved beyond recognition since 1945. Modern air-to-air combat takes place at ranges measured in dozens of miles, not hundreds of yards. Pilots never see each other. Missiles track targets automatically. The idea of men in gun turrets manually aiming and firing at attacking fighters seems almost medieval by comparison. But the fundamental truths haven't changed. Air combat is still about geometry, timing, and the courage to fly toward danger rather than away from it. The B-24 gunners of World War II understood this. The Luftwaffe pilots who attacked them understood this. In those frozen skies over Europe, in battles that lasted seconds but felt like eternities, men on both sides faced death with whatever courage they could muster, fought with whatever skill they possessed, and hoped desperately that when the day ended, they'd still be alive to see another sunrise. The legacy of these battles influenced military doctrine for generations. The concept of strategic bombing, the use of long-range heavy bombers to destroy an enemy's industrial capacity, was validated by the campaign over Europe. But it also demonstrated the costs of such campaigns and the importance of air superiority. Every air force in the world studied these battles, drew lessons from them, and incorporated those lessons into their own planning. For the men who flew and fought in those skies, the experience marked them forever. Whether they were American gunners or German pilots, they'd seen the face of modern industrial warfare. They'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was functioning despite fear. They'd learned that survival often came down to luck as much as skill, and they'd learned that war, for all the speeches and propaganda, really came down to young men trying to kill other young men before those other young men could kill them. This is the story of the B-24 gunners and the Luftwaffe pilots who faced instant death in the skies over Europe. It's a story of technology and tactics, of bravery and terror, of men pushed to their limits and beyond. It's a story that deserves to be remembered, not glorified, but understood for what it was, a chapter in human history, when the mathematics of violence reached new levels of sophistication, and the cost of that sophistication was paid in the lives of young men on both sides who deserved better than the war they were given. The training pipeline that created these gunners began thousands of miles from the European battlefield, in places like Laredo, Texas, and Las Vegas, Nevada. Young men, most barely out of high school, volunteered or were drafted into the Army Air Forces. They went through basic training. Then, if they showed aptitude and weren't needed as pilots or navigators, they were sent to gunnery school. The course lasted 6 weeks and was designed to transform farm boys and city kids into efficient killing machines. The training was relentless and comprehensive. Students started with classroom instruction on the Browning M250 caliber machine gun. They learned to disassemble and reassemble the weapon blindfolded because in combat, at high altitude, wearing thick gloves in the dark of night or in the chaos of battle, they might need to clear a jam by feel alone. Each gun had 47 moving parts. Each part had to be memorized, understood, respected. A gun that jammed at the wrong moment meant death, not just for the gunner, but potentially for the entire crew. The Browning M2 was a remarkable weapon, designed by John Browning in the aftermath of World War I. It fired a cartridge that was half an inch in diameter and almost 6 inches long. The bullet itself weighed between 650 and 700 grains, depending on the type. Ball ammunition for general use, armor-piercing for hardened targets, incendiary for fuel tanks, tracer rounds that burned bright so gunners could see where their fire was going. Most gunners loaded their belts in a pattern. 4 ball rounds, 1 tracer, 1 armor-piercing, 1 incendiary. This gave them the ability to see their fire while maximizing destructive effect against various target types. After learning the mechanical aspects, students moved to the range. They started with stationary targets, learning the fundamentals of sight picture and trigger control. Then moving targets, clay pigeons thrown into the air. Then towed targets, sleeves pulled behind aircraft that the students fired at from the ground. Finally, if they progressed far enough, they flew in training aircraft and fired at towed targets from the air, experiencing for the first time what it was like to track a moving target while you yourself were moving, while the wind buffeted you, while the cold numbed your hands and the noise of engines and guns overwhelmed your senses. The best students, those who showed natural aptitude and could consistently hit targets, were sent to specialized schools. Some became instructor gunners, teaching the next wave of students. Others were selected for flight engineer training, learning not just to shoot, but to understand every system on the bomber, becoming the pilot's right-hand man. The very best, those with exceptional eyesight and reflexes, often ended up as tail gunners or ball turret gunners, the most critical defensive positions. But no amount of training could fully prepare a man for the reality of combat. Staff Sergeant Walter Smith remembered his first mission vividly, even 60 years later. He was a waist gunner on a B-24 named Liberator Bell, part of the 93rd Bomb Group, flying out of Hardwick in England. The target was the submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire on the French coast. The briefing officer had told them to expect light to moderate flak, but probably no fighter opposition because the target was at the extreme range of German fighters based in France. The briefing officer was wrong. They were 30 miles from the target when the fighters hit them. Smith saw them coming. Dark specks diving out of the sun, exactly the way they'd been taught to watch for, but somehow different, more real, more terrifying than anything in training. He called them out on the intercom, his voice higher than he wanted it to be, adrenaline making his hands shake. The top turret gunner acknowledged. The ball turret was already rotating to track them. The first fighter came in from 2 o'clock high, a Focke-Wulf 190, its nose lit up with muzzle flashes as its cannons fired. Smith swung his gun around, trying to get a lead on it. But the fighter was so fast, so much faster than the towed sleeves he'd practiced on. He pressed the trigger anyway, felt the gun buck and roar in his hands, saw his tracers arc out into empty space behind the fighter. He'd let it too much or not enough, he couldn't tell. The fighter flashed past, so close he could see the black crosses on its wings, the pilot's head in the cockpit. Then it was gone, diving away beneath them. The second fighter came from the other side. Smith spun around, nearly tangling himself in his oxygen hose and intercom cord. This time he didn't think, didn't calculate, just pointed and fired. His tracers converged on the fighter's wing route. He saw sparkles of impact, metal flying off, then the fighter rolled inverted and dove away. Had he hit it? Had he damaged it? He had no idea. There was no time to think about it, because a third fighter was coming in now, and a fourth, and the sky was full of them. The battle lasted perhaps 10 minutes. Though Smith would have sworn it was an hour. The B-24 shuddered under the impact of cannon shells. Somewhere forward, someone was screaming. The intercom was chaos, voices overlapping, everyone trying to call out fighters at the same time. Smith fired until his gun barrels were smoking, then kept firing. His shoulders ached from the recoil. His ears rang despite his headset. The smell of burned powder and hot metal filled the aircraft. Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, the fighters were gone. Either they'd run out of ammunition or fuel, or they'd decided the bomber formation was too heavily defended, or they'd been called off to intercept another formation. It didn't matter. They were gone. Smith slumped against the fuselage, suddenly exhausted. His hands were shaking uncontrollably now. He looked down and realized he was standing in a pool of spent brass casings that came up to his ankles. The pilot came on the intercom. Damage report. The navigator had been hit by shrapnel in the shoulder, but was still conscious and working. They'd lost one engine and another was running rough. The hydraulic system was damaged. The radio was out. But they were still flying, still in formation, and the target was 10 minutes ahead. They would complete the mission. They dropped their bombs on the submarine pens, though from Smith's position, he couldn't see the results. Then the long flight home. 5 hours across the English Channel and over hostile territory where more fighters might attack at any moment. 5 hours of watching the sky, muscles tensed, ready to grab his gun at the first sign of danger. 5 hours of thinking about what he'd seen, what he'd done, wondering if any of the rounds he'd fired had killed anyone. They made it back to Hardwick. The landing was rough because of the damaged hydraulic system, but the pilot got them down in one piece. When Smith climbed out of the aircraft, his legs barely supported him. He looked at the B-24 and counted over 80 holes in the fuselage and wings. Some were small rifle-caliber holes, others were large enough to put his fist through. How they'd stayed airborne was beyond him. That night in the barracks, Smith couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that first Fokker-Wulf coming at him, saw the muzzle flashes from its cannons. He kept thinking about the moment his tracers had hit the second fighter, kept wondering if he'd killed that pilot. Part of him hoped he had, because that pilot had been trying to kill him. Part of him hoped he hadn't because killing was something he'd never done before, and wasn't sure he wanted to do again. But he knew he would have to. This was only his first mission. He had 24 more to go before he could go home. 24 more chances to die, or to kill, or both. The Luftwaffe pilots faced similar psychological pressures, but with different contexts. Where American gunners flew a set number of missions and then rotated home, German pilots flew until they were killed, captured, or so badly wounded they could no longer fly. There was no rotation system, no defined endpoint. You flew and fought until the war ended, or you did. Lieutenant Karl Schneider was 19 years old when he first encountered American bombers. He'd trained on obsolete aircraft with minimal fuel because gasoline was already becoming scarce by late 1943. His total flight time when he was assigned to a combat squadron was less than 150 hours. He'd never fired his guns at a real target, never experienced combat, never even flown in formation at high altitude. His first mission was an awakening to realities no training could simulate. The squadron commander briefed them quickly. American bombers heading for Munich. The squadron would attack from the front, head-on passes, focus on the leaders. Break away before you reach the formation. Reform, attack again if possible. Simple in theory, suicide in practice. Schneider climbed into his Messerschmitt 109 with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The engine started on the second try, coughing blue smoke until it warmed up. He took his place in the formation, struggling to maintain position because the more experienced pilots flew with an economy of motion he hadn't yet mastered. Every correction he made was too large, causing him to overcorrect, then overcorrect again. They climbed to 28,000 feet, higher than Schneider had ever flown before. The cold was incredible, seeping through his flight suit despite the layers he wore. His oxygen mask froze to his face. Ice formed on the inside of his canopy, forcing him to scrape it away with his gloved hand so he could see. Then he saw them. The bombers. Dozens of them, arranged in their combat boxes, flying in perfect formation, utterly implacable. They looked unstoppable, like some force of nature that could not be turned aside by mere humans in fragile aircraft. The squadron commander's voice crackled over the radio. Attack! Now! Schneider pushed his stick forward, diving toward the lead bomber. Speed built rapidly. 200 kilometers per hour, 300, 400. The bomber grew in his windscreen, filling his vision. He could see the gun turrets tracking him, following his approach. He armed his weapons, 20mm cannons, 2 of them, 2 machine guns. He put the pipper of his gun sight on the bomber's nose and pressed the firing button. The Messerschmitt shuddered as the cannons fired. He saw his rounds impact somewhere on the bomber. Couldn't tell where exactly, because he was closing too fast. 500 meters, 400, 300. The bomber's guns were firing at him now. He could see the tracers, bright lines in the air. Some of them so close, he could have reached out and touched them if he'd been standing on the ground. 200 meters. He was going to collide. The thought hit him with absolute certainty. He was going to fly straight into that bomber, and they would both explode, and that would be the end. He pulled back on the stick hard, too hard, the Messerschmitt groaning under the G-forces, his vision greying at the edges. The bomber flashed overhead. So close he could see individual rivets on its belly, see the ball turret rotating to track him as he passed beneath. Then he was through, diving away, pulling out, looking around frantically for the rest of his squadron. 2 Messerschmitts were on fire, falling out of the sky. A third was trailing smoke, its pilot trying desperately to nurse it home. The bombers flew on, seemingly undamaged, though Schneider knew some of them had to have been hit. The squadron commander ordered them to reform for another attack. Schneider couldn't believe it. They were going back in. They were actually going back into that hell. The second pass was worse than the first because now he knew what to expect. He saw one of his squadron mates take a direct hit from a .50 caliber round that punched through his canopy and killed him instantly. The Messerschmitt nosed over and dove straight down, the dead pilot still strapped in his seat. Schneider's own aircraft took hits, several of them, metallic impacts that sounded like someone hitting the fuselage with a hammer. One round went through his left wing, leaving a hole big enough to see through. Somehow nothing critical was hit. After the second pass, they had to break off. Half the squadron was gone, killed or damaged so badly they couldn't continue. The survivors limped back to base, Schneider's aircraft handling sluggishly because of damage to the control surfaces. He landed, taxied to his revetment, shut down the engine, and sat in the cockpit for 5 minutes, unable to move, unable to process what he'd just experienced. The ground crew chief climbed up on the wing, looked at the damage, shook his head. The aircraft would need at least 2 days of repairs, probably more. Schneider climbed out, his legs unsteady. The squadron commander was standing by the operations building, watching the survivors land. 4 aircraft had taken off. 2 were back. One more landed 10 minutes later, its pilot wounded but alive. The 4th never returned. That night, Schneider lay in his bunk and thought about probability. If the squadron lost half its strength on every mission, and he flew 2 missions per week, how long before his number came up? The mathematics were simple and terrifying. He had weeks to live. Maybe a month or 2 if he was lucky and skilled. But luck ran out. Skill could only carry you so far when you were outnumbered and outgunned and the enemy kept coming. Wave after wave after wave of bombers that you couldn't stop no matter how many you shot down because there were always more. The psychological warfare inherent in this type of combat was something neither side fully anticipated. American bomber crews knew their odds of survival were poor, but they could count down their missions. 25 missions and you went home. Later in the war, they raised it to 30, then 35, but there was always a number. You could mark them off, watch the total slowly decrease. Tell yourself that you just had to survive 1 more mission, then 1 more, then 1 more. It was a psychological crutch, sometimes the only thing that kept men functional when fear threatened to overwhelm them. German pilots had no such crutch. They flew until they died. The knowledge was corrosive, eating away at morale and combat effectiveness. Some pilots requested transfers to other units, to the Russian front where they'd face Sturmovix and Yaks, instead of flying Fortresses and Liberators. The Russian aircraft were dangerous, but they didn't have 10 50 caliber machine guns each. Others simply broke under the strain, developing phantom illnesses or suffering psychological breakdowns that ended their combat careers. The physical conditions of high-altitude combat added another layer of hardship. At 25,000 feet, the temperature could drop to 50 or 60 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Oxygen was essential because the air was too thin to breathe normally. Gunners wore electrically heated flight suits, but these sometimes failed, leading to frostbite. More than one gunner lost fingers or toes to cold, continuing to fight, even as their extremities froze, because stopping meant leaving their position uncovered and endangering the entire crew. The oxygen systems themselves were problematic. Early in the war, they used demand-type systems that delivered oxygen only when the wearer inhaled. These worked, but they were uncomfortable and required conscious effort to breathe. Later systems used constant flow oxygen, which was better, but consumed oxygen faster, limiting flight duration. Gunners had to monitor their oxygen flow constantly. Too little and you'd suffer hypoxia, your judgment would deteriorate, your reflexes would slow, and you might pass out. Too much and you'd deplete your supply before the mission ended, which meant hypoxia anyway, just later. Hypoxia was insidious because it impaired judgment while making you feel euphoric. Gunners suffering from oxygen deprivation sometimes became convinced they were fine, even as their lips turned blue and their fingers lost coordination. Crew members were trained to watch each other, to check in regularly over the intercom, to recognize the signs of hypoxia in their crewmates' voices, slurred speech, delayed responses, nonsensical statements. If you heard these signs, you alerted the pilot immediately. If the affected crewman didn't respond to orders to check his oxygen supply, someone had to leave his position and help him, which meant temporarily abandoning a gun position and leaving the aircraft more vulnerable. The ammunition supply itself represented a critical limitation that both gunners and attacking pilots understood. Each 50 caliber gun position on a B-24 carried approximately 500 rounds. That sounds like a lot until you remember that the gun fired at 800 rounds per minute. Full auto, continuous fire, and you'd be empty in less than 40 seconds. Gunners were trained to fire in short bursts, 3 to 5 seconds at a time. conserving ammunition for multiple engagements. But in the heat of combat, with fighters coming from multiple directions, that discipline sometimes broke down. More than one gunner expended all his ammunition early in a mission and spent the rest of the flight helplessly watching as fighters attacked, unable to contribute to the defense. Luftwaffe intelligence knew about these ammunition limitations and tried to exploit them. Some German fighter units developed tactics where they'd make multiple false passes, approaching to within 1,000 yards but breaking away before entering effective range, trying to goad the gunners into wasting ammunition. Once they believed the bomber's ammunition was depleted, they'd press home a real attack. American commanders countered by ordering gunners to hold fire until targets were within 600 yards, ensuring that when they did fire, they had a reasonable chance of hitting something. The development of computing gun sights represented a significant technological advancement that improved gunnery effectiveness. Early in the war, gunners used simple ring and bead sights, essentially no different from rifle sights, hitting a target moving at 300 miles per hour, from a platform moving at 200 miles per hour, at ranges up to 1,000 yards, while accounting for relative angles and deflection was extraordinarily difficult with these basic sights. The best gunners developed an intuitive feel for deflection, a sense of where to aim based on the target's angle and speed. But this took months of experience that many gunners didn't survive long enough to acquire. The K-series computing gun sights changed this equation. These sights, developed by Sperry and other manufacturers, incorporated a simple analog computer that automatically calculated deflection based on the target's range and angular velocity. The gunner would place the sight's reticle on the target and track it. As he tracked, he would adjust a range dial, estimating the distance to the target. The sight would then automatically offset the aiming point to account for deflection. While not perfect, these sights dramatically improved the hit probability, especially for less experienced gunners. But technology could only go so far. The human element remained critical. Gunnery, like all combat skills, required a combination of mechanical proficiency, tactical awareness, physical conditioning, and psychological resilience. The best gunners possessed all of these qualities in abundance, but they also possessed something harder to define: a coldness, an ability to see another human being, to recognize that person's humanity, and then to kill him anyway, because that's what the situation required. Staff Sergeant Raymond O'Connor exemplified this mindset. A ball turret gunner from Boston, O'Connor was credited with 7 confirmed kills and 11 probables over 30 missions. When asked after the war how he'd been so successful, he said it was simple. He didn't think about the pilots as people. They weren't husbands or fathers or sons. They were targets, threats, things that needed to be destroyed before they destroyed him and his crew. The moment he started thinking about them as human beings, he knew he'd be dead because he'd hesitate, and hesitation in aerial combat was fatal. Other gunners couldn't maintain that psychological distance. They saw the faces of the pilots they shot down. They watched parachutes deploy and men drift down toward Earth, and they wondered about those men, whether they survived, whether they were captured or escaped, whether they had families who would mourn them. These thoughts could paralyze a man in combat, could cause him to hold fire when he should shoot, could get his entire crew killed. Some men who couldn't maintain the necessary psychological detachment requested transfers to other duties. Others simply broke down and were diagnosed with combat fatigue, what we'd now call post-traumatic stress disorder, and were removed from combat status. The Luftwaffe faced similar psychological challenges, compounded by the growing realization that they were losing the war. By mid-1944, it was obvious to anyone paying attention that Germany could not win. The Eastern Front was collapsing. The Western Allies had landed in Normandy and were pushing inland. German cities were being systematically destroyed by round-the-clock bombing. And still the bombers came, day after day, and still the fighters rose to meet them. And still men died in the cold, thin air over Europe. Some German pilots became fatalistic, convinced that death was inevitable, and the only question was when and how. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler was one of these men, an experienced pilot with 28 confirmed kills. Stigler described his mental state in late 1944 as detached from reality. He flew his missions mechanically, attacked bombers because that was his job, watched his friends die because that was inevitable, and waited for his own death because that seemed equally inevitable. Then on December 20th, 1943, something happened that changed his perspective. Stigler encountered a badly damaged B-17, limping home alone after a raid on Bremen. The bomber's tailgun was destroyed, Its nose was shot away. One engine was dead, another sputtering. It was barely staying airborne. Stigler pulled alongside and looked into the waist gun position. He saw a gunner there, wounded, slumped against the fuselage, looking back at him. Their eyes met. Stigler could have shot the bomber down with ease. It was helpless, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the memory of his commander's words, that you never shoot at a man in a parachute, that once an enemy is defenseless, you don't kill him. Maybe it was exhaustion with the killing. Maybe it was a moment of recognition that the men in that bomber were just like him. Scared young men far from home trying to survive a war they didn't start. Whatever it was, Stigler didn't fire. Instead, he escorted the bomber toward the North Sea, waving off other German fighters who tried to attack it, making sure it made it to neutral airspace before he turned for home. This incident, which became known after the war when Stigler and the B-17's pilot, Charles Brown, eventually met and became friends, illustrates the complex humanity that existed even in the midst of brutal combat. Most encounters between B-24 gunners and Luftwaffe pilots ended in death for one side or the other. But occasionally humanity broke through. Occasionally, men who should have been killing each other chose a different path. Such moments were rare exceptions to the general rule of violence. The vast majority of encounters followed a predictable pattern. Fighters attacked, gunners defended, men died. Aircraft burned and fell from the sky. The survivors flew home, counted their holes, mourned their dead, and prepared to do it all again tomorrow. The damage that .50 caliber fire could inflict on aircraft was catastrophic. The rounds traveled at nearly 3,000 feet per second, carrying tremendous kinetic energy. When they hit an aircraft structure, they didn't just puncture it, they exploded through it, creating exit holes much larger than the entrance holes, spraying fragments in all directions. A burst that hit an engine could tear it from its mounts. A burst that hit a fuel tank could ignite it, turning the entire aircraft into a fireball. A burst that hit the cockpit could kill the pilot instantly, leaving the aircraft uncontrolled. German fighters were particularly vulnerable because they were smaller and less robust than American bombers. A Messerschmitt 109 or Focke-Wulf 190 was fundamentally a very fast, very maneuverable aircraft built as light as possible to maximize performance. This meant thin skin, minimal armor, and no redundancy in critical systems. A single .50 caliber round in the wrong place could destroy a fighter. Multiple rounds in any location could be fatal. The Luftwaffe tried various modifications to increase survivability. They added armor plate behind the pilot's seat and around critical components like the engine and fuel tanks. They installed self-sealing fuel tanks that would close around bullet holes, preventing fuel leaks. They experimented with reinforced structures and redundant control systems. But every pound of armor and reinforcement was a pound that reduced performance, and performance was life in a dogfight. The balance between protection and capability was never satisfactorily resolved. American bombers faced the opposite problem. They were large, sturdy aircraft that could absorb tremendous damage and keep flying, but they were also slow and unmaneuverable. A B-24 that lost an engine would fall out of formation and become easy prey for fighters. A B-24 with damaged control surfaces might become uncontrollable. The redundancy built into the aircraft helped. 4 engines meant you could limp home on 2 or even 1, but there were limits to what any aircraft could survive. The most feared damage for any bomber crew was fire. Gasoline fires were almost impossible to extinguish at altitude. The wind fed the flames and the aircraft's own speed turned it into a blast furnace. If fire broke out in an engine, the procedure was to immediately feather the propeller, shut off fuel to that engine, and activate the fire suppression system. Usually this worked. Sometimes it didn't. If the fire spread to the wing structure or reached the fuel tanks in the wings, the crew had perhaps 30 seconds to bail out before the aircraft exploded or broke apart. Bailing out of a stricken aircraft was itself a terrifying and dangerous procedure. At high altitude, you needed to delay opening your parachute until you reached denser air. Otherwise, you'd drift for miles and likely die from oxygen deprivation or hypothermia before reaching the ground. But falling free for 20,000 feet or more, watching the earth rush up at you, required nerve that not every man possessed. Some men froze, unable to jump from the aircraft even as it fell burning around them. Others jumped, but panicked and pulled their ripcords too soon, dooming themselves to a slow death as they drifted down through sub-zero temperatures with no oxygen. If you survived the bailout and landing, your ordeal was far from over. If you came down over Germany or occupied territory, you'd likely be captured. Treatment of captured airmen varied widely. Some were treated reasonably well according to the Geneva Convention. Others were beaten or killed by civilians angry about the bombing of their homes and cities. Luftwaffe pilots sometimes protected captured American airmen from mob violence, seeing them as fellow warriors deserving of respect. But the SS and Gestapo had no such compunctions, and airmen who fell into their hands often disappeared into the concentration camp system. If you came down in friendly or neutral territory, your chances were better but still not guaranteed. Evading capture in occupied France or Belgium required help from the resistance networks, ordinary people who risked their lives to shelter downed airmen and move them along escape routes back to Allied lines. Thousands of American airmen owed their lives to these brave men and women who had every reason to hate them for the bombs that sometimes fell on French and Belgian cities instead of German ones, but who helped them anyway, because they were fighting a common enemy.